Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Michael Steinke. I work at the School of Life Sciences at the University of Essex in England. And together with Ute Meyer, who's also on the webinar, we are overseeing, we are organizing these BioYUFE webinars this year. And this particular webinar is on green exercise and mental health. And I just want to briefly say a few words about YUFE, the Young Universities for the Future of Europe, which is an alliance of various universities across Europe to basically stimulate transnational education and research. And as a BioYUFE group, we are sort of a grassroots initiative that tries to promote particular natural sciences, life sciences, biological sciences initiatives as part of YUFE. So what we have today is three eminent presenters in this webinar. There's Nick Bradshaw from the University of Rijeka. He will introduce the webinar talking about protein aggregates in the brain and involvement in mental illnesses. And yesterday he told me that's the biologist's view. So he gives us the perspective of the biologist. And then we move on to his colleague at the University of Rijeka, Professor Luca Malatesti, who works on personality disorders and their effect on social responses. And he gives us the philosopher's view, so a slightly different angle to the issue of mental health. And then we want to finish off with Nick Cooper from the University of Essex, one of my colleagues here, to talk about nature-based interventions to alleviate the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorders. So all of this should run within 1 hour. Hopefully we will be able to stay in time. This webinar is recorded, I should say. If you have any questions or comments, you can ask live. We'll give you some time after the presentations, or you add your questions to the chat as we go along. So when I Googled green exercise, that's one of the prime images that came up, a relatively fit person running through a green environment. But I very quickly found out green exercise is not limited to this. Green exercise could also mean that you've got a health issue. You might be immobile. You may have a mental health issue, and other green exercises like gardening, for example, could assist you with your mental health and well-being. So green exercise goes much further than just running through a forest, I would imagine, but we'll hear much about it from our presenters today. And at that point, I also asked myself, is it just limited to the color green? Can we imagine blue exercise? I'm interested in water sports. I like to go sailing. Is there such a thing as blue exercise, or does it also fall within the same remit of being green? Before I forget, this is not sort of the best place maybe, but I don't want to forget mentioning this. This webinar concludes the BioYUFE webinar series for this academic year. I say that if you would like us to assist you with organizing a webinar as part of the BioYUFE webinar series, or you have ideas for topics that we should be covering, or any other feedback, please get in touch. There's Ute's email address on there and my email address. Ute, as I said, is my colleague in assisting me with running these webinars. So please get in touch using our emails. So without much further ado, again, I go straight over to Nick Bradshaw in Rijeka. Nick, if you want to go ahead and share any slides that you've got, and then it's over to you.
Very much. Okay, thank you very much, Michael. So for my section of it, I wanted to talk to you a bit about how we see mental illness as biologists, give you a bit of an introduction. Now, to start with, reasonable question, why study mental illness? How big of a problem are they? I looked up some data for my adopted home country of Croatia. This is what causes disability amongst people aged 20 to 25 years old, so students and their peers. And reasons that students suffer from disability, amongst the top 10 are 4 which we could classify as mental disorders, or at least related to mental health: self-harm, depression, anxiety, drug use. These sort of figures are quite common across Europe. Germany, again, we have very similar things coming up. United Kingdom, my original home country, even more so. 5 of the top 6 causes of disability amongst young people could be classified as mental illness or mental illness related. These are severe conditions which affect our youngest members of society. Now, this wouldn't be such an issue if we were good at treating them. And we do have lots of medications, but their efficiency is not what we would like. As an example, there is a common class of antidepressant called an SSRI, which is used for treating depression in its various forms. And if you gave one to 100 people suffering from depressive symptoms, probably from 40 to 60 of them would see a noticeable improvement, at least in the short to medium term. The issue is that because we can't measure someone's recovery biologically, because we have to look at what they say they feel, if we give them a placebo, a sugar pill or something instead, still 20 to 40 of them would appear to show improvement. What this means is that our most commonly used antidepressants are maybe only 20% effective, meaning that most patients have to take lots of medications in order to find something that works for them. With other things like antipsychotics for schizophrenia, the figures are a bit better, but still a long way from what we want. Now, it would be reasonable to guess that because we have some medications, we have some idea of how they work. This is true to an extent, but unfortunately, I can't tell you that we figured out mental illness and then said, right, how do we treat it? Instead, the story of mental illness pharmacology is lots of weird coincidences. So, for example, there is a chemical naturally made that is useful in malaria. During World War II, when this wasn't commonly available, various synthetic versions were designed, and these eventually led to another chemical that was no use for malaria, but did cause drowsiness. And this was then tried on patients and led to the first commercial antipsychotic. No one was aiming to make an antipsychotic here. It happened over time. And these sort of stories are abundant in mental illness research. We generated a set of compounds which are useful. We then twiddled with them, improved them, got some more out of them. But there aren't so many stories where we said, right, we understand what this disease is. Now we will decide how to treat it. However, what we can say is that, ironically, the other way around, the medications have been quite useful for figuring out what mental illnesses are. Once we knew that this treated schizophrenia, this treated depression, we then asked what do they do in the body? And almost all of them affect the same sort of process. When you have 2 neurons, nerve cells in the brain, electrochemical message will go down one of them, and it then has to find a way to jump a gap from one neuron to the next one in order to send the message. And it does these by releasing these little chemicals called neurotransmitters, which pass from one nerve cell to the other and convey the message. And it seems that most of our medications in some way affect this. So we can say that there are a number of neurotransmitters which are clearly very important for mental illness. Schizophrenia, for example, is historically at least mainly associated with affecting dopamine, also affects serotonin, glutamate, number of different pathways. Major depressive disorder, which I should generally refer to as just depression for the sake of this, also affects serotonin, but also to an extent works to the other as well. It's a complicated picture. It's not nice and simple that we can say schizophrenia is the dopamine disease, major depressive disorder is the serotonin disease. There are differences, there are overlaps. What we can say, though, is that it appears that the symptoms of mental illness largely come because things go wrong with our neurotransmitters. The message is being sent from one neuron to another. And we know this mostly because our current medications, antipsychotics and antidepressants, affect this process. However, there must be something beyond that. What causes neurotransmission? What is mental illness? Now, this is very hard to answer. A slightly simpler question would be to say, what can cause it? What things give an individual a higher risk of developing any given mental illness? Initially, this was studied using twins, classic approach where you can say you've got 2 sets of twins, one that are identical and therefore share their entire genome, one that are non-identical, only share half their genome. And by saying if one twin has a disease, what's the risk that the other does, we can get information about how much of this is genetic. This was done in several populations, and what was found out is that if one twin had depression, their non-identical twin had about a 12% risk of having it as well. Now, this is higher than the average person in the population, but still not staggering. However, if an identical twin has depression, their siblings' risk is much higher, showing the effect of genetics. Schizophrenia, it's dramatically higher. Normally, only about 1 in 200 people suffer from schizophrenia, but if your twin has it, your risk is much higher. If your identical twin has it, your risk is very high indeed. Clearly, genetics and environment both play a role here, because genetics gives some risk, but even if you're genetically identical to someone else, it's not a guarantee. Now, when I talk about environmental risks, what sort of things are there? Well, for example, we know that if a mother suffers from influenza at certain periods in her pregnancy, it leads to a slightly increased risk that her child will develop schizophrenia in later life. It's only a small risk, but it does happen. Similarly, mothers who've experienced famine during pregnancy, their children are slightly more likely to develop schizophrenia. It seems that if things go wrong at one crucial point while the brain is developing, it leaves little defects or at least anomalies in the brain, which may or may not then go on to develop to be mental illness. There's also more subtle stuff. Weirdly, if you are born in the first few months of the year, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, your chance of most mental illness is a tiny, tiny bit higher than if you were born in the middle of summer, for example. If the parents are very old or the mother is very young, again, slightly increased risk of most mental illnesses. Cannabis, if you smoke cannabis, your risk of schizophrenia in particular raises. And trauma, particularly during childhood, but also to an extent in adulthood, increases the risk, in this case, more of depression. Now, I just want to caution you that these are only tiny effects. You're going from a 0.5% risk to a 1% risk, for example. So please don't panic if any of these apply to you. Nevertheless, we can kind of put together a little bit of a picture where it seems that if certain things go wrong while the brain is developing, particularly before birth, then these defects could potentially lead to the changes we see in mental illness. Things that go wrong in birth or before birth have an effect on this, put these defects or abnormalities in place, but then later in life, other things can kind of act as the trigger to lead to the symptoms themselves. And it's likely that genetics fits in more to the neurodevelopmental side. I won't go into genetics in any great detail, other than to say many of my colleagues have worked a lot on this. The biggest study to date on schizophrenia, for example, involved over 75,000 people with the condition and almost 250,000 healthy individuals as controls. And what they found is that more than 250 genes, or at least regions of the genome, convey risk of mental illness to the person with it. However, again, these effects are tiny. Maybe you need lots and lots of these to add together to give you a substantial risk of developing depression or schizophrenia or anything else. I want to emphasize that there is no single gene or no single environmental effect that causes any mental illness. If there was, we would have discovered it years ago. However, many, many things can each increase our risk of mental illness, presumably because they impact on the biology of the condition. However, to date, we've only explained a very small proportion of this risk, maybe about 7.5% of the genetic risk of schizophrenia, for example. So for the last 5 minutes of this talk, I want to very quickly talk to you about an approach that me and some of my colleagues have been taking, which is inspired by the neurodegenerative diseases. So these are things like Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease. Now, these conditions also have lots of genes which impact on the illness. However, mostly people don't study these. Mostly people focus on 2 proteins, well, a protein and a peptide, A-beta and tau, because these are known to accumulate in the brain in the form of aggregates. And this is what most people study. What do I mean by aggregate? So this is the idea that when the body wants to produce a protein, it initially produces it as a long linear string of amino acids. This string then folds up to be whatever state it needs to function, but sometimes this goes wrong. If the folding goes incorrectly, the cell can try and correct it, or failing that, the cell can just break it up into pieces and start again. However, sometimes that's not enough. Sometimes the cell is so overloaded with these badly folded proteins that it kind of stores them together in these big lumps, which may be structured, may be unstructured, that we call aggregates. And in diseases like Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's, Huntington's disease, specific proteins form these aggregates, and probably these are related to how the disease progresses. So we asked, as an alternative way to study mental illness, whether it was possible that similar things were happening in the brain. Now, for the sake of time, I will only talk about one experiment that we did about 10 plus years ago now, which is that we took brain samples from 15 people with schizophrenia and 15 control individuals with no known mental illness. We then took the schizophrenia samples and processed them to try and purify from this whole sample just the part of the brain that was really insoluble, the part of which would not dissolve in a liquid no matter how hard you tried. And the logic here was that because these proteins, when they aggregate, form large lumps, they probably won't easily be dissolved. So through a series of steps, we purify out just the most insoluble, maybe 1–2% of the brain, on the theory that this will contain anything that is aggregating. And then we injected this into a mouse. Sounds a little bit mad scientist, but the logic here is that the mouse's immune system would react and identify the proteins that we injected into it. Basically, it would generate antibodies against any aggregating proteins that had been in this original schizophrenia brain sample. We then searched these antibodies and managed to find one antibody that recognizes a protein present in schizophrenia brain, but not in control brain. A protein that was aggregating in one or more of our schizophrenia patients, but not in any control individuals. This protein is called VOBP. We had never heard of it before. We hadn't looked into it. It was no known risk of schizophrenia or other mental illnesses at all. However, it's involved in lots of processes, some of which are involved in the development of the brain, so it sort of makes sense. We then later looked in a separate group of individuals with schizophrenia and depression and found that about half of the people we investigated, and it was still a fairly small sample, but about half of them also showed these aggregates to potentially be present, whereas only a few control individuals did. It therefore seems that possibly this protein is aggregating in mental illness. And with the help of collaborators, quite a few proteins have been identified in this way. Where are we going with it? We're very much looking now at other samples because we've only looked at fairly small groups so far, see if this is a universal feature of the disease. And my group particularly focuses on the mechanism of how this affects cells, how these aggregates form, why they form, what they do. And we don't believe we've got the whole story, far from it. We're always interested in identifying further proteins. Ultimately, the goal would be to improve diagnosis of mental illness and maybe eventually lead to more therapeutic options in the future. Okay, I have 10 seconds left, so I will quickly thank my colleagues, in particular my PhD students whose names are in bold here, and also my former mentor, Carsten Kort from the University of Düsseldorf, who initiated this project and whom I still collaborate on. Okay, thank you very much.
Right. Thanks very much, Nick. What we will do is we move straight over to Luca, I would suggest, and then if people would like to put their questions into the chat or ask them later live, that would be most appropriate. I'm hoping that we have decent time towards the end of the webinar to accomplish that. So over to Luca straight away, a colleague of Nick's at the University of Rijeka in Croatia.
Okay, hello everybody. Thank you very much for being here. Also, thanks to Nick that gave me the framework where I can try to push my philosophical analysis. Okay. I work in the framework of so-called analytic philosophy of psychiatry. This is a type of philosophy that is focused on the fundamental concepts involved in the theoretical and practical sides of psychiatry. Here you have a couple of books. One is nice, it's by Wilkinson. Sam Wilkinson is a colleague from Essex that wrote this very important and clear introduction to the philosophy of psychiatry. Philosophers of psychiatry debate several problems. Some of them have to do with the ethics of psychiatry, what we should do with patients, what are the more humane, the more ethical ways to handle this type of individuals in different kind of social settings. But the central question in philosophy of psychiatry is what does confer to a cluster of mental states, behaviors, and traits is status of mental disorder. And philosophers call it the mental disorder or illness status problem. And here the focus is on disorder, what makes this condition disorders, and of course the focus is in the concept we use to think about this condition. I will try to clarify a bit what is this problem of the mental disorder status in philosophy of psychiatry, and then I'll give you three possible answers that philosophers have given to this question: hard naturalism, hybrid position, and hard normativism. I won't take stance. I think just is important to present you this position and some of the argument for and against, and then you'll decide by yourself which you think is the most plausible answer. So the first thing is extremely important to distinguish the problem of the mental disorder status from the causal problem of mental disorders. These are two different problems. So the causal problem is the problem of explaining mental disorders. What kind of factors should we consider in explaining why a person has a mental disorder? The mental disorder status is the question what makes that type of mental life, behavior, personality trait should be declared a disorder. And these two problems are not the same problem. So it's wrong, for example, to show that depression is a mental disorder because you can mention genetic or neurological causes. You need something more to solve the problem, what makes depression a disorder. It's not enough to show causes. If you think about having human behavior, traits, a mental life can be caused by something in the brain on our genetic makeup, but doesn't this make it a disorder? Okay. Why philosophers are so obsessed, I would say, at least in philosophy of psychiatry, with the idea of what makes a condition a disorder? Because if you look how disorders, mental disorders are defined, you find symptoms, and these symptoms are descriptions of mental states, behavior, or personality traits, so nothing to do with biological markers or genetic information. And these states are declared symptoms when they show some kind of inappropriateness. So a person who sees a danger where none danger exists, and he does it in a systematic way, we may think that he's anxious, that he has some kind of inappropriate reaction to the environment. And so we may think that this can be symptomatic. Similarly, a person could be extremely sad, a sadness that is not appropriate for the situation of the person. Still, this can then indicate a symptom, some excessive amount of sadness that maybe relates to depression. Similarly, in some kind of psychotic disorder, a person has delusions, and delusions are some kind of beliefs that the person cannot revise despite all the good evidence we could offer to this person. So again, there is this inappropriateness, having mental states, traits of behavior that don't align to some kind of expected idea of normality. And so we could think that the overall problem of the disorder status of mental disorders can be defined in the problem of characterizing what kind of standards are involved in determining the departure from these standards are symptomatic of a mental disorder. So I would say a mental disorder is a cluster of behaviors, mental states, or personality traits that are the symptoms of these disorders where they involve a departure from a standard, a certain standard, let's say, of normality. And philosophers try to understand what are these standards. One theory, the first theory we find is so-called hard naturalism. Hard naturalism is the doctrine, and this is been advanced in the 60s by Thomas Sachs, that says that when we want to specify those standards that fix what is normal or not in our mental life, we must just use standards that are coming from the natural sciences. And for example, Sachs said that a mental disorder, if it's something, is something that is caused by disordered neural processes in the brain, and this disorderness of these brain states depends on the existence of some kind of objective standards of anatomy and physiology of the brain. So the idea here is there are these disorders in the brain, disorders insofar certain biological, neurological, or physiological laws or standards are violated, and these things, if they cause anxiety, delusions, extreme sadness, they determine symptoms of a mental disorder. So at the same time, the disordered brain state causes the disordered mental states. It also confers to these states their symptomatic status. So a delusion is bad, is a symptom of a mental illness only if it's caused by a disorder in the part of the brain that causes beliefs. So that's the idea. By using this type of description of what the concept of mental disorder is, meaning a concept that refers to symptoms, mental states, traits that are caused by disorder mental brain states, Sachs could advance a very radical criticism to psychiatry. And this criticism could be also probably used today because he noticed that mental disorders are defined by symptoms that depart from health or normality standard that rest on political, ethical, general epistemic values about what we assume to be normal. As I said, even if you look contemporary diagnostic manuals in psychiatry, mental disorders are not individuated in terms of biological disordered causes. They are individuated by observing inappropriate mental states, behavioral traits, but their inappropriateness is determined on the basis of implicit assumptions about what is normal. According to Sachs, but these standards cannot define a proper scientific notion of mental disorder. Therefore, many of the things that we call disorders are just misalignment, not deviation from social standards. So there are problems of living, people who cannot cope with our requirement about how happy we should be about our life, how epistemically in touch with the reality, and so on and so forth. So according to Sachs, given that the majority of mental disorders do not satisfy his definition of mental disorder, we should abandon these categories. His idea was that either a mental disorder is a neurological problem or is a problem of living. There is nothing between, because he gave this very demanding definition based on purely biological, neuroscientific standards. This position may seem okay. I think also Nick was saying, look, we found disordered neurotransmitters. So if you found disordered neurotransmitters, they may cause the typical mental states and behavioral performances of people with schizophrenia. Then you may say, that's why those things, those behaviors and mental state are disordered, because they are caused by disorder neurotransmitters. But here the challenge is trying to specify what are the standard, the fix that a neurotransmitter or the activation of a certain part of the brain is disorder. Can we use, for example, statistical normality? That seems to be problematic because we have many brains that are statistically different from the statistic norm, but we wouldn't call them disorder. Geniuses, talented artists, and so on and so forth. So one challenge for SATs and those who embrace this hard naturalism is to tell us what are these objective standards of disorders, meaning objective standards of disordered brains, or even if you think about objective standards of disordered genes. Another problem is that completely SATs removes the role of social values on our understanding of mental disorder. But it's enough to think that it's reasonable to assume that disorders are harmful things to us, to introduce our preferences. In order to say that something is harmful, distressful, not valuable for us, we need some kind of system of reference from our perspective as individual or as society to judge that that condition is not okay. So it seems there are several problems with SATs. An alternative account is the hybrid position advanced by Jerome Wakefield, so-called HD account of illness, because it involves two components. First, a mental illness or a mental disorder is something that is harmful, something that really impacts on the life of the person in a negative way. And what is harmful, of course, depends on the person. For example, a person with depression realizes that she cannot fulfill her preferences in life. The person maybe wants to be a scientist, but this depression is holding her back from achieving this preference that she has. Or in certain cases, to kind of assumptions that the society makes about what is good for human beings. You all know that in many cases of mental disorders, one of the problems for the person is exactly that she cannot determine what is harmful or not to her. So we need some kind of external social assumptions when a certain condition is harmful to a person. Twist it as you like, but in this account, so harm and the social and personal values play a central role in fixing what is a disorder. But then Wakefield is also aware that if we will just run the notion of mental disorder just based on social or personal values, we risk to medicalize variations, biological variations. And the history of psychiatry is full of these cases. Take homosexuality. In the past, there were also a category of running slave as a mental disorder. So not just the values are relevant. And therefore, the second component of a Wakefield account is the idea of biological dysfunction, an objective, naturalistic, evolutionary maladaptiveness. So if you have a condition, a certain configuration of your brain that is dysfunctional from the point of view of an adaptive evolutionary theory of how the brain developed or the psychology of the brain, and then you show that this condition is also harmful, you have a mental disorder. Dysfunctions that are not harmful are not disorders, because lacking harmfulness, there is no reason to intervene or cure individuals. So also it's a kind of, for example, Wakefield approach to mental disorder blocks all those debates concerning homosexuality, whether or not it's a dysfunction. It can even be dysfunction from the point of view of biology, but still, if it's not harmful, there is no need to intervene and medicalize and regard that condition as a mental disorder. This account is very nice because it's hybrid. It has both the advantages of having values and also the kind of more scientific, strict requirement that you find in hard normativism like in SATs. But it's a bit unpractical because at the moment we have beautiful theories about the evolution of the mind and the evolution of its disorders, about evolution of the brain. But our understanding of these things is not so fine-grained, for example, to discover what are the evolutionary dysfunctional mechanisms supporting, for example, delusions or depressions. So this seems to be a problem. And so in a sense, we should wait to have a complete evolutionary account of the functioning of the mind to then develop an appropriately grounded, scientifically grounded psychiatry. And so it would be too revisionary. Maybe certain disorder could be proved nowadays that they are evolutionary dysfunctional, but it would be very difficult for others. So this is a tool revisionary. It's not an anti-psychiatry, but some argue that is almost so close to the idea that we should revise psychiatry as we do it. Bolton is one of the philosophers who criticize, Derek Bolton, who criticized this type of approach. And also there is this given fact again that harmfulness seems to be the paramount moment when the psychiatrist encounters the patient, or when scientists do classification of disorders, the first thing they are very interested in is the harmfulness. So we may have a different position, and this is some kind of hard normativist. And they say, opposing the hard naturalist, that the standard, that N who gives the norm of what is healthy or abnormal, pathological in mental health, should just be based on our values. So the idea is that we start with mental state, behavior, trait, science that for some reason, with good reason, we don't like, we find to be harmful. And then if we found causes in the brain or in our genetic makeup that produce these things that we don't like, given our preferences and values, we can call those things disorders. So for example, I have nothing against Nick. I love this presentation, but just to use for example, when he says, Nick, oh, there are disorder neurotransmitters, in this understanding of the concept of mental disorder, we would say that those neurotransmitters are disorders insofar they cause mental states, behavior, other signs, traits that we as people or as society disvalue. So that's the idea. So somehow the disorderness goes from the mental towards the biological. So first we decide that something is disorder, and then if we found the causes of that disorder thing, we say, oh, this causes disorder as well. And this is the position of hard normativism. So just I conclude here, being a philosopher, I don't give answer. I just like to mess up with the implicit assumptions of people and force them to give their own answer. So what does confer disorder status to a condition? Purely natural norms, natural and normative, social value norms, or purely social values. You decide. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Luca. Nice presentation. If you want to come out of the share, and if Nick wants to get ready in case Nick has any slides as well. Yeah, this is very interesting. There's one person, the biologist, who tells you, yeah, you just measure this and that, and then you know whether you have a mental illness or not. And then there comes the philosopher and says like, no, you know, it's really quite difficult. So very interesting. Nice friction there between the two presentations. I love that. So I'm hoping that there will be few questions brewing already, but before we get into those, let's give the floor to Nick, please. Nick, if you want to take over from here.
Yeah, I will do. Thanks a lot, Michael. So yeah, I'm going to maybe not put the philosophy aside for one moment, but I'm just going to focus in on something that we might be able to do in the real world to help, whether it's a disorder or not. So I'm going to be looking at how we can use nature to support people with PTSD. And I'm going to pose a little question along the line about, you know, what can we do when we know that there are things out there that can help people? What can we do with people who don't engage with therapy, for example? And how can we try to get them to engage? And I'm going to suggest that we might be able to use our ally nature to help us to do that. I'm going to begin with a very quick bit of background. I should say that I've got more things on my slides today than I'm going to have time to actually go over. But I've decided to keep them on the slide so that those of you who are interested can go back and look at the YouTube recording later and sort of zoom in and freeze what you want to have a look at. So here goes. So my background is at the University of Essex with Michael. And as Michael has already hinted at, the University of Essex is a centre of research into green exercise. And I came to it really from my background as a neuroscientist, And I've been studying how stress affects the brain as we age for many years. And to cut a long story short, and to be brutally honest with you, I was very, very tired of telling people a bad, sad story about how our brains were being messed up by what we were doing to them through the course of stress. And along with a colleague, decided to see if we could put something into action that might actually help people. And we decided to focus in on one extreme example of a stress disorder, if you like, PTSD. There's a picture of me giving the game away, showing that I was always a keen fisherman and knew that it helped me, and I wanted to see what else we could do. This is the colleague, Dr. Mark Wheeler, who I was working with, and I mentioned him because he is a chartered health psychologist who works here in Essex, in Colchester, specialising in trauma. And most of you might not know that Colchester is what we call a super garrison town. So it's one of the main centres of the British Army in the UK. So he was seeing lots of military people, both serving and veterans, with issues. And particularly, one of those main issues was people coming to him with PTSD and other trauma-related problems. So just to give you a very quick overview, of what PTSD symptomology is. Most of you have probably heard about the flashbacks that can happen where people suddenly are, mentally back at the scene of where the trauma happened to them in the first place. They also may have nightmares and other intrusive day-to-day thoughts. People, particularly with combat PTSD, tend to be hypervigilant and are always on the lookout for threats in the environment. They tend to have increased levels of various hormones and stress-related neurotransmitters. They often are very isolated, and loneliness and helplessness is a big side effect, if you like, of PTSD. And they also tend to engage from many social activities, often from fear of what they might do if they feel that their PTSD is being too difficult to cope with at that particular time. There are various treatments that are in the UK are recommended for PTSD, and these, vary from sort of trauma-focused CBT that most people would have kind of expect to be used, to more sort of strange things like EMDR, where you use movement of eyes while recalling memory. Seems to be particularly useful, but we don't know why. And also some trauma exposure therapies as well. However, and this is the problem that Mark came up against in his practice, military veterans in particular are less likely to enter therapy. And there are a number of reasons for this. There are things like shame and embarrassment is one of the main ones. Not wanting to be seen as weak or as a malingerer, particularly to their peers. And on the flip side of that, wanting to be strong for their comrades and wanting to be there for them in their problems. They also don't trust civilian therapists or doctors, comically referring to psychiatrists as trick cyclists. So they're very unlikely to engage, but even those that do tend to drop out earlier than other people. So there is an issue there. So we wanted to think if there's something that we could do to try and help here. And we knew from the literature that there are various things out there that show that you can alleviate some PTSD symptoms. And one of the main things is to try and re-establish social support, whether that's with other veterans, so peer support, if you like, or with the broader community in general. Those things we know already help. And we also knew from our work and other people's work that green exercise can be helpful here. And I just want to give you a quick overview of some of that, of why we think green exercise might work. And to answer Michael's question about whether blue exercise is a thing, yes, blue exercise is a thing. And also there's a hybrid, if you like, of blue-green exercise, which I probably would count our research as being part of. Anyway, I'm not going to have time to go through all of this, but there are many theories underlying why green exercise is working, but most of them are kind of from a psycho-evolutionary background. And the very basic idea here is that, we evolved in a natural environment for millennia or for millions of years, in fact, before we were even human, and that our bodies and our brains are adapted to that environment. And when we take those bodies and brains out of that environment and put them in, for example, a normal environment, there are various stressors and things that go wrong. So getting people back into a natural environment can start to re-establish and rebuild those connections and issues that were happening. So the concept then that we came up with, that we're calling casting away trauma, just because we wanted to have a nice little sort of hook, was we wanted to create a non-stigmatizing outdoor recreational experience. So that means that we could invite our military veterans, for example, to come along, and they don't have to say, I'm going for therapy or anything like that. In fact, they're not coming for therapy, they're coming for a weekend's fishing. And so there's no stigma attached to it at all. We wanted to expose people to nature. And we found that actually being around a fishing lake in a really nice, tranquil place is a really good way to start doing that. We wanted to enhance the peer support, enhance the military bonds, if you like, and try and encourage people to talk to each other, as simple as that. And that's exactly what we find happens. And there's something also about being in nature that encourages people to open up and to engage and to talk to each other. And we also, as a little add-on, if you like, wanted to help build well-being and self-esteem through the acquisition or the increase in people's skill base. So either teach them a new skill, for example, if they've never come fishing before, or make them better at that skill if they've already done it before. And we've made a little picture to try and explain to people what happens when they come on one of these weekends. Yeah, I'm not going to go through all that now. You can zoom in on that later if you want to. So just quickly, some of our early findings. So when we first started out, we weren't definitely sure that angling would be good. So we compared it against falconry, so working with birds of prey. And we also compared it against an equine experience. It wasn't actually horse riding because we couldn't get the the cover on that. So we had people with a horse for a day, learning how to look after them and brush them and all of those kind of things, and walking the horse along. And you can see here, these on the left here, we have their PTSD symptom scores. And you can see a nice decrease from 2 weeks before doing the intervention to 2 weeks after, and then a month after following up, seeing it is coming back up a little bit at that point. And you can see that the angling worked the best. And also importantly, from our perspective, it was something that we could do relatively cheaply. And we knew that we would be able to roll it out much wider than, for example, making people being able to have access to horses. We then did a small randomized controlled trial where we had a waitlist group, which is the red line here, and we had an active intervention group who came fishing, and you can see that the waitlist group didn't change very much at all, and we had a nice significant decrease in PTSD scores for those who actually came fishing. Which brings me on to what we're up to at the moment. So we've done lots and lots of things, but our current big project is something funded by NIHR, which is like the research arm of the NHS in the UK. And the idea is that we are aiming to build the evidence base for what they call nature-based social prescribing going forward. So basically the Department of Health in this country wants to be able to roll out nature-based interventions for people, but it doesn't yet have the evidence base in order to be able to do that properly. So we're part of a group of other universities building that evidence base. We've also expanded the scope somewhat from just military veterans to also looking at emergency service personnel. So that's also police, fire service, ambulance service, prison wardens, even the RNLI, anybody who's a blue light worker as such. And that's because they have a higher instance of PTSD than the normal population. They are also harder to get into therapy, similarly to the military veterans. And they also have a very close affinity with the other uniformed services. So when we bring them together, they get on very well. So what happens in this project? Well, it's a randomized controlled trial. So people either join the fishing group or they join the waitlist control group. We take all of their scores at the same times, but then the waitlist group come fishing a few months later. So everybody gets the intervention in the end. So that's the kind of ethical aspect of it that we really wanted to be able to provide. They do surveys measuring various aspects of mental health 2 weeks before the intervention, then 2 and 4 weeks after, and now we're also doing a long-term follow-up at 6 and 12 months. And everything's done online, and so that it's easy to roll out, and all data can then be anonymized easily as well. The actual intervention is, so we've actually got a 10-year lease on a set of lakes in Essex, and we bring people to these lakes for 2 days and 1 night. So typically they arrive on a Saturday morning and go home on the Sunday afternoon. They sleep over on the Saturday night at the lakeside. You can see it's a really nice green and blue space, Michael. There's lots going on there, and a really tranquil place, and lots of other things beside that we lay on, including a social area, which we find particularly important as the weekend goes on. We provide food and barbecues and all those kind of things. So it's a really, a useful place for people to come and to not only get back to nature, but get back to being with other people as well. Here's just some of the scores from the developmental phase of the main project that we're doing at the moment. There's an awful lot going on here, and I haven't got much time, but basically we're showing there's PTSD scores top left, depression scores top right, anxiety scores bottom left, and well-being bottom right. And you can see significant improvements for the angling group in all of those measures, and not in the waitlist control group. Putting it another way, if you look at it in terms of what was the clinically significant change? So how did people actually get better in a way that would actually be noticed by themselves and by a doctor? So in the intervention or fishing group, 60% of participants achieved clinically significant change, as opposed to 11% in the waitlist group. And there were various things that affected that, but I don't have time to go into that now. So one of the things that we are trying to investigate in this main project is what are the mechanisms. So we set up with this idea of looking at various things like nature, peer support, learning new skills, but what do they actually make a difference? So we've got various questionnaires built into the project that allow us to look at if it is nature, if it is peer support, if it is skill improvement, and how do those factors interact? I don't have those results for you yet, but that's something that we're really trying to tease apart, because clearly, and I would assume, it's not going to be any one of those things alone. The main phase itself is quite a large randomized controlled trial. We're aiming to get just under 200 people from our power sample. We've already done 7 interventions last year. We're doing 9 over the course of this summer, so that's all my weekends gone. And then we've got another 7 next year. I just wanted to take a moment to publicise that. So if you guys know anybody out there who you think could benefit from taking part, please either get in contact with me, or maybe Michael could pass on an email if that's what. And yeah, there's also a whatever they're called, a code thing there that you can take a picture of when you look at this back, and that will take you to a website telling you more. That's it, really. That's my thing for the day. Carpe diem, seize the day, get out there and be back in nature. Thanks a lot.
Great. Thanks so much, Nick, as well. Much appreciated. Yeah, in the interest of time, we should jump straight into any questions. I'm hoping that Nick, Luca, and Nick, that they will be able to stay for a few extra minutes. We still got 37 participants on the line. We started with 40, so this is a really good outcome. People are sticking with you. So that were some really interesting presentations that you had there. Are there any questions? Again, raise a hand, open your microphone, or put something in the chat, and then we come to those questions if there are. I give you a few more seconds before I start asking the first question. Nothing coming so far. I think I will then kick off with my first question. Nick, I was wondering, Nick Cooper, that is, I was wondering about how your relationship develops with the participants. You know, when you're spending 2 days with them, or you meet them already 2 weeks online, you meet them before they meet you in person. But how does this relationship change? Are the participants, are they still wary at the beginning? That's what I was wondering. You know, you're still the psychiatrist, aren't you, for them in the first few hours?
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. So what normally happens is that people arrive quite anxious and more than a little nervous. And what we do is we get everybody together, but very quickly give them the health and safety briefing, and then they're passed on to their angling coach. So we have one angling coach for every 2 participants. So everybody can get one-on-one coaching over the course of the weekend. That coach will take them away to their own special place by the side of the lake. So everybody has an individual tent that they sleep in with a lovely comfy camp bed and all sorts of things. And so the coach gets them established, gets them fishing, and then they're told, okay, there's a social area over there. You can go over there whenever you want, make teas and coffees, have a sandwich. And gradually over the course of that Saturday, people start to come over a bit and start to socialize a bit. But the nice thing is that they have this, they know that they can go back to their tent and go back to fishing anytime they like without having to make any excuse. So anytime it begins to feel a bit too much, a little bit, the anxiety is getting a bit too high, they can just walk away, say, I'm just going to check my rods. And you just find that they start over through that kind of natural progression, interacting more and more and more. So by Saturday evening, most people come to the barbecue and sit around and have a chat, and then they'll go back to their rods. By Sunday morning, breakfast time, it's starting to get a bit harder to get rid of them, to get them back to, because they want to, you know, and they particularly want to chat to each other. But as you say, us as well, they're very happy to chat with us, but they treat us a bit like, particularly the military veterans, treat us a bit like officers, and they take the mickey out of us and make fun of us and all of those things. And it's kind of, yeah, it's fun, and it's kind of part of it. But yeah, I wouldn't say that there's particularly, from our perspective, close relationships build up, more so with the angling coaches that they're working with. So
Great, thanks very much for that, Nick. I want to use this right as a jumping board to go straight to Luca, actually. Luca was nodding while Nick was giving his explanation there. Do you think that you know, this is possible? Can you change somebody's mental health within a few hours, or how we perceive that person's mental health? Do you think that, you know, from a philosopher standpoint, is that possible? And then Nick Bradshaw, you can think about, you know, what happens in the brain then? Is that feasible, that these things are actually putting themselves in place and remain?
Yeah, great. I mean, I cannot answer you the empirical question because I don't do experiments, but I was very intrigued by this idea that we have practically all what's happening with this individual, from the diagnosis to this very sound ways of helping them. I wouldn't even call treatments. I would say way of helping in a very respectful, ethically sound way people. Yeah, it's very interesting that everything here happens without having to go, not even at the level of some kind of, okay, neither genetics, brain, or even deep psychological mechanism. I mean, computational, the kind of the contemporary science of the mind offer us. We start with a human problem, and we deal it in the context of things that we all understand, that being in nature is great. Of course, then the tough scientific work is to quantify, measure, and validate this ordinary understanding. So yeah, I was nodding because I think that should be the first way of intervening, in my opinion. And then when this kind of more ecological, social, interactive ways don't work, we may have a reason for move to the kind of more biologically oriented intervention. So yeah, I found very, very inspiring, because also PTSD, as far as I read, some people think it can only be addressed with heavy medicalization. So I was really, really inspired by this experience. And of course, the possibility to handle it in a scientific way by measuring. And so.
Thanks for that, Luca. Nick, do you want to add something from your point of view?
Sure. So, I mean, mental illness, as we've established, is a very complicated concept. I go for the very reductionist, what can we find out on the tiny level that does something? But this is only happening at the cellular level. This adds up over millions of cells and what's going on over circuits, etc., to create a very human, very complicated pattern of thoughts, emotions, and how we perceive them. And we've known for a while that we can treat mental illnesses through both those approaches. We can go for the small-scale chemical approach, does something specific with consequences, but we also know from classic therapy approaches, especially group therapies, that these social approaches do have an effect on treatment. And whether the green aspect of it is crucial or whether it's just a very clever way of getting people into group therapy, I don't have the answer to, but I guess ultimately it doesn't matter. I mean, it's something wrong. I mean, I want to know the mechanism. Luca wants to know the mechanism. We're doing it by very different approaches. But ultimately, what this is all about is helping people. And if there are a group of people that can be helped through this approach, great, roll it out as soon as possible. For the people that we can't do, we'll need to investigate other approaches. And certainly, I think with my research, the aim is not so much to develop new therapies in the near future, it's to be able to help characterize people and say, you have this biological version of it, therefore you'll respond better to this drug or maybe to this therapy or whatever it is. It's this sort of personalized approach. But yeah, if we can treat patients with the tools that we have, there is absolutely no reason why we shouldn't do it. If it's safe, if it's ethical, go for it. It's a great talk. I really enjoyed it, both of you.
Great, thank you, Nick. Yeah, people are dropping off a little bit. We are past the hour already. Don't feel obliged to stay on any longer if you've got other things going on. There's one question on the chat that was directed straight to me, so I read that out. That's for Nick Bradshaw. Did you ever look into psilocybin as a treatment option for mental illness? And if so, what do you think of that? Do you think that might be a more viable option? And then it goes on and says, also in the context of these prior questions, working on something consciously for a session and consciously sort of rewiring your brain, literally and figuratively. So that's probably a mix between Luca and Nick B question there. So Nick, first a question on psilocybin. Is that something that you know of, and has it been tried?
We certainly haven't. I'm only dimly aware of it, I'm afraid. I've been trying to avoid too much the different treatment approaches beyond the classic psychiatric compounds, not because the rest are important, they really are. It's just harder to model in a system. But there are many pathways to dealing with these common problems. We use the whole toolkit. I'm sorry, I can't give a specific comment on that approach. And the other one was...
So the other question was maybe between Nick and Luca, Nick B and Luca. The question of whether if you're working or if you're angling, if you're focusing on something different, I just, reword this here. Does that assist with rewiring your brain, in a real sense, in a biological sense, but maybe also in a, beyond biology, in a more philosophical sense, that your view of the world may then change? And Nick already alluded to that after the 2 days, people have a more positive outlook, I guess, on themselves and on everything else that's happening around them. So is that possible from a biological and from a philosophical standpoint, Nick B and Luca?
I mean, from a biological standpoint, yes. I mean, certain elements of the brain are hardwired while it's initially developing, but to take an analogy, the software is still adaptable. So yes, many different approaches can help us restructure our patterns of thought in a biological sense. So yes, I would say so.
Okay, Luca?
Yeah, just I would like to add an interesting feature. So we are used to think about science, the distinction between the observer and the entity observed. If you do chemistry, physics, there is the scientist and there is the world out there. But the interesting thing philosophically, I would say, about psychiatry or psychology or therapy in general, is that the patient, the object in a sense of the investigation and treatment, can also think about himself by using the same concept that are given by the scientists. So you may not just have your brain changed by the intervention that could be medical or group therapy, but you have an active role on reshaping yourself by using what science offers you. So I think this is kind of gives not just the fact that the brain, being a physical thing, everything modifies everything, but also the specificity of the brain that can model itself via the help of the concepts and the strategies and understanding and insight you may get from a therapist. So I think, yeah. Then if all this level of change can be reduced to the more basic level of the brain, or there are different levels, computational, whatever, this is secondary if we fix our focus, as Nick B was saying, helping people.
Right,
but
good.
always is intriguing how people are not passive in therapy. They can embrace the theories thrown at them and the strategies and the insights. They can self-modify.
Okay, thank you,
Very
Luca.
quickly,
Nick.
Michael, from what I understand about the psilocybin work, and a team I used to work with have been doing it in Australia for a while, is that it does exactly that in sense of that we know that people with depression, for example, get into literally a brain state that is very hard to get out of, and the thinking goes round and round and round over and over again, and so does the behaviors. And psilocybin is a drug that seems to allow people in order to break out of that temporarily. I know it's a very basic way of putting it, but it seems to be pretty useful. And the team I was working with are using that for PTSD as well, alongside formal therapy, and getting some really good results from that. So.
Great. Thanks very much. Good. I think we need to probably come to an end here. We are almost 10 minutes over the hour already. Thank you very much again, Nick B, Luca, and Nick C for the presentations today. Much appreciated. There were a few comments on the chat already. Thank yous. I don't know whether you've seen that. So people are appreciative of the things that you had to say, even though they may not want to ask questions directly. But we had a really good discussion. Good. As I said right at the start, this concludes the current academic year series of the BioYUFE webinars. There are more to come. Ute and I myself, we are both very interested to hear your views or any ideas, suggestions for topics that we could cover in the next year. And I'm hoping that this is going to continue with your support, of course, you, the participants. So watch out for any coming announcement. I thank you very much for joining us today, for your interest, and wish you all the best for the rest of your day. Thank you very much.